Welcome, welcome to all. Dawn, thanks for joining us as well. Thank you all for coming to our March Learning Series. I want to begin with asking all of you to just take a breath. I know you're transitioning from other meetings, other convenings, other sessions, maybe family. There's always a lot going on in our backgrounds. I don't know about you, but when I go to a meeting, an event, I usually just kind of step in, take a breath, and try to scan the room and get centered before I have an opportunity to start communing with people, start communicating with people. And I think in the virtual world, we forget to give people time to just take a breath and step in. So thank you all as you do that. If you can in the chat, in addition to letting us know your organization, your name, feel free to let us know a word. Give us a word to let us know how you are coming in to our space to gather a word or two. My word is absolutely energized. Mostly because I get to be with all of you and with our speaker, a person who I both admire and learn from every single time we have an opportunity to meet. I'll give you more on her later, but for now, my name is Uva Coles, and I'm Chief Learning Officer with SpringPoint Partners. If you are new to SpringPoint, we are a social impact organization rooted in Philadelphia and with a national footprint that allows us to support and center and invest in transformational leaders, networks, and solutions that power community change and advance justice. That's a mouthful, but at our very core, we're simply excited to follow and invest in the leadership of thoughtful, diverse movement makers aligned with our priority areas. Many of you are with us today. Today's session is part of our learning series. If you're familiar with our series, welcome again. If you are new to SpringPoint Partners, we designed these virtual containers as optional, single-purpose, single-topic sessions where thought leaders share human-centered stories, perspectives, tools, and practice that others can learn from along their leadership journey. Here, we try to create space for partners to connect with each other and to also grapple with topics they are working through. And our greatest aspiration at the end of the day is that we share a human-centered approach or a solution that is a value add. Today's session, Emerging Human Resources Practices for Evolving Nonprofit Leaders, will be led by Dr. Alison Dougherty, Assistant Vice President, Office of Institutional Equity and Inclusive Culture at Drexel University. Alison also happens to be a human resources consultant, strategic consultant, who some of you may already know, especially those of you who are Hive partners and have had an opportunity to meet with Alison in the past. Always, our goal in these sessions is to have a classroom that kind of comes alive, that breathes. So our intention for our time together is really designed to be really interactive. So Alison will create space for you to ask your questions, respond, reflect to the things she's saying. We don't want to wait until the very end, so we're going to pepper questions and opportunities for you all to interact with her and with each other along the way. So that's what today will look like. I'll introduce Alison, who will lead us through a discussion for the bulk of our time together. And then, as I mentioned, we'll kind of pepper opportunities for you to engage with her more directly. You don't have to wait until those questions come up. Use the chat as much as you can. Talk to each other, reflect on things, chew on things. Let us know if something doesn't land exactly right. That's okay as well. We learn from that. So we want this to be an opportunity to be in conversation with each other. So after the official, after all of my preamble and my internet is also a little unstable, so my apologies, but I have my partner, Lauren, here. So if at some point I disappear, Lauren will take over and make sure that we keep this going. I hope it's able to stabilize. That said, please mute yourselves if you haven't already. This session, as you can tell, will be recorded, and our intention is to post it and also share it so that if you miss something, you may be able to capture it a little bit later on, reflect on it, and learn from it as well. Again, if you're able to be on camera, please turn your cameras on. If not, we completely understand. So let's get started. I think a good place to start is with a reminder. I think to be in a position of leadership is to know the importance of centering human beings in our work, no matter the industry, the sector, the community, or impact area you might serve. And I think, if nothing else, the last few years have reminded us of the importance of thinking about human beings, right? In a more honest, more pronounced way in our homes, in our communities, and certainly in the world of work, among other places. Our relationship with talent management, I think most of us could agree, has shifted dramatically, and our need to strengthen that relationship has become even more clear. Alison, as I like to call her. I'm not honoring your name completely or your title, Dr. Dougherty, but Alison is someone who's led in the nonprofit space and in the higher education space, so she can relate to the space that you occupy. She's done this for the bulk of her career. She is well versed in the human resources and organizational strategy spaces. You can look for her bio, look at her bio for those details. But what I will lift in addition to what you may read about her, is that I have seen her lead through some of the most rewarding times and also some exceptionally challenging times. And in every case, she's been a thoughtful human who is never afraid to address the unaddressable, to speak with candor and care, and to consider the needs of human beings, no matter their organizational position, their background, or their identity. Alison leads with an inclusive and equitable lens and is an unapologetic, sober, thoughtful truth teller who knows how to build bridges between leaders and their teams, bridges that invite us all to take courageous steps toward each other. That is her superpower. With that said, I'll turn it over to Dr. Alison Dougherty for her words, her wisdom, and her approach to the work that we are here to learn from today. Alison.
Thank you so much, Uva. I'm looking around for who you're talking about. So I really appreciate your kind words, and I'm really excited to be here with you all today. I love the work that I've had the opportunity to do with Spring Point Partners, either with the team there or with some of you I know in the Hive, and adjacent to their work has been really wonderful. So I hope that this session is beneficial for you all. As Uva mentioned, you will have the slides, I think access to the recording as well. I'm also always available to answer questions after, if there's anything you want to talk through. Why I do this work is to help where I can. I will apologize as we start. I will take more frequent sips of water than typically because I was stuck. Those of you with, I don't know why they call them spring sports, as the weather is very temperamental these days. So I was in a freezing cold lacrosse game on Monday night, and I think unfortunately the weather got the best of me. So the crackly voice and the sips of water, I appreciate the grace for that, but I'm happy to be here with you all. So I'm going to, despite the practice for tech, I think I am going to share my screen. But after however many years of this, I never know if I get it right. So today, as Uva talked about, we titled this session, Emerging Human Resource Practices for Evolving Nonprofit Leaders. Quite honestly, I think that as we're seeing developments with technology, innovations, emerging trends are appearing, I think, day in, day out. The one thing I want to talk about, even with Uva's intro, has shifted. I think a lot, and I've worked in the higher ed space for quite some time, where we still refer to human resources as human resources, but I love even the movement towards people operation, people and culture, people centered. I think as we think about the work and our employees and the people that we're serving, it's often, and you'll notice kind of straight through, that everything I talk about is really centered around people. Throughout the presentation, I have the standard copyright information, but if there's anything that you want to use, just let me know. It's no problem. For the most part, if there's anything that you can take back to your boards, to your constituents, I'm always happy to share. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to have these quick talks sprinkled throughout, and this is really this is not me talking for an hour and a half. Honestly, I hope to do the least of the talking. I have some slides to guide us and to hopefully generate some conversation. But I think crowdsourcing is the best way, is how I've done my best work when I've asked colleagues or bounced ideas off of others. I think Uva the other day on LinkedIn said, "What's the best piece of advice you've received," or something of that nature. And I saw someone, or "What's the best piece of advice you have for people starting out in the workplace?" And, someone noted, again, because Uva was crowdsourcing, someone noted making sure that you check with colleagues or those within your field when you're unsure of something. So being comfortable to ask the questions. So when I have questions like this up here, you're welcome to drop your thoughts in the chat. I know we have a chat moderator here. I will look at them as well. You can send them directly to me if you don't want it out there for everyone to see. Or if there's the ability to participate, I'm also happy if someone wants to discuss. So take some time to reflect. It's almost an oxymoron. Reflect for a quick talk on how things have evolved for you since the pandemic and how you've adapted as a leader. And it's great. Uva's getting us started with learning to share my humanity in a greater way. Not an all volunteer organization anymore. Okay. And that's, I think, particularly for some of us, depending on how organizations start. We know sometimes in the nonprofit space, as an organization, you might be heavily volunteer run, and then you make that transition. And it's when you start to think of human resources or people and culture, going from maybe 1 or 2 paid team members to, 5, 10, 15, 20, a lot of these things start to evolve. Yes, a lot of people, so shifting to a fully remote working environment. So even using Zoom, I think back to 2019, I was at a university, and whenever we needed to do a Zoom, tech support needed to come in, 5 administrative assistants, it was just quite the feat. And now the fact that we can just jump on. Okay, if someone sent to me individually, has been a month in their role, and new to the country, so really challenging to kind of the reality of the workforce. So I think that's when we think about HR, you'll see a lot more movement overseas. There's some in the States, but overseas around a 4-day work week, really, and many times you'll see on social media, on Instagram, the posts about someone going away, an out of office message in Germany saying, "I'm out of the office for the summer to bike across the country. I'll see you in September." But then you'll see in the United States, I'm out of the office for a major surgery, but I'll be checking my email intermittently. And so I think some of those cultural changes for sure. Adapting to work from home, telehealth, become more flexible with work-life balance, hybrid work environment, large growth, a lot of compassion for younger people. This is great. Multiple sites expansion. So it's wonderful to see some of you have expanded, doubled capacity, and because of needs, again, when we're looking at some of the needs of the community after COVID, this is specific to animal shelter. Challenging rigid workplace, cultural norms. This is a great one. So more willing to challenge kind of what we know, how work was defined for us, how human resources was defined for us for so many years. Great. So it seems like, there's a lot of positive here, and I think there's a lot of, it's likely why many of you are here as we're talking about evolving human resources since the pandemic. And I think I love the ideas. I'm seeing a lot about increased transparency, and we'll talk a little bit about the generational shift in the workplace and really the demand for transparency when you're thinking about pay equity, when you're thinking about salary. But I think, again, as I said, Uva kicked it off, and really, I think the one thread kind of throughout this is humanity, care for people, creating this culture of care within our organizations. Thank you. Thank you for showing up immediately. So now to set the stage, I'd like you to think through what your 2 greatest human resources challenges are right now. And again, you could drop those in the chat as well. And I'll give you a moment to think. And I'm seeing some great examples here. Career pathing, so career pathways. A lot of times you'll have people coming into a role wanting to know, what's their trajectory? And if it's obviously a large corporation, it may be easier to spell that out. When you're a smaller team, it can be a challenge. Lack of trust in leadership, intergenerational needs and approaches, talent expectations, equitable competitive compensation, a lot of responsibility for a small team, room for growth and learning, recruitment of qualified candidates. It's been a job seekers market for, it's shifted a little bit, but it's still, many would say it's still a job seekers market. Working with broader leaderships around policies, so flexible work, onboarding culture. I think a lot of times when you have, someone said earlier about having so much on your plate, having a large portfolio. And so when you bring, sometimes it's more of a challenge as a smaller team when you bring someone in, because you have to stop the work and make them feel welcomed and work on the onboarding, which can be challenging. Positioning the HR department, so we have someone who's first in their role. Lack of experience dealing with HR issues, right? When we think through those difficult conversations. Cascading values is so important too, even like the question that came up around career pathing. So how do you as an organization espouse your values, and how do those trickle down throughout the organization and into your work and your performance reviews? Comp and benefit. Great, these are really great. Fast growth. Casting a wider net, so diversity, generational differences. Accessibility for neurodivergent employees. These are wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing those. And I think it helps me to kind of think as we go through the conversation, where the conversation can go and how we can move from here. So, I don't know if you're like me. Every now and again, one of the things when I'm on the train in the morning, I might kind of peruse LinkedIn. And sometimes you read these wonderful things and you think, wow, this is so idealistic and not realistic. But the other day, there's this roundtable page on LinkedIn, kind of full of influencers in senior roles at position. And Toby Aluwale wrote, had this post that was, I believe it was on X, and then it was shared on LinkedIn, and it really resonated with me. And I think a lot of when we talk about how the pandemic impacted us, either our organizations or individually, as I said, a lot of us talked about the people side of things, the humanity, we had the great resignation, the great reshuffle, because people were leaving their work because it reset priorities as we watched what was happening globally. And so your manager has more impact on your mental health than your therapist or your doctor. Having a good boss can literally change your life. And so I think, I want to start off as leaders to have us thinking about how important it is and the impact that we have on the people who we lead or manage every day. And sometimes moving through the day-to-day, moving through the chaos, we tend to, and I'll come back to this at the end of the presentation, because I think there were some tips that were part of that roundtable discussion on LinkedIn. But for me, I think I consider myself as someone who leads with humility and kindness. And especially the work that I do on the HR side is around a lot of civil rights work, a lot of employee relations work, a lot of those difficult and challenging conversations. I've done them as parts of large institutions, but I've also had them working with smaller institutions, doing kind of culture and climate checks, helping work through their employee relations issues. And even when you're having those conversations, people often say, how can you do those? How can you do that job? It's so difficult. And for me, if you do it with kindness, even if they're difficult, you still can have respect for people who are in those places. So this just really resonated with me on my scroll through LinkedIn. And it was something that I wanted to share because I think it can help to guide our conversation. And so the conversation I want to have is I want to talk a little bit about the landscape that we're in, which has been ever evolving. We're going to talk about talent management and compensation, which came up for some of you, building trust and inclusion. So some tips and takeaways for building inclusion, and then we'll have time for questions. In each section, I have, similarly to what I did in the beginning, kind of stop points for discussion. And I know we use the chat. I know in the virtual world, the chat is really easy, but I'm also open if somebody wants to raise their hand and share and start a discussion. I think it's an intimate enough group that it's 100% appropriate. There's also in the chat, if you want to add or stop at any point or raise your hand, please feel free to. I think the more that this is, again, I'm going to just go back to crowdsourcing and how important it is throughout. Somebody wrote in here, navigating healthy boundaries in a virtual world and on a small team. And, I also saw recently, I was at the Philly SHRM event, the Society for Human Resources Management, and someone said no is a complete sentence. And it was around, the ability to say no, and you can simply say no, and the importance of putting up boundaries, because sometimes people can take advantage of your boundaries. And I know that, that resonates with me, someone saying that boundaries or setting boundaries has been a challenge, because I think in a virtual world, when I go into my office and I get on the train home, I'm able to kind of unplug and kind of get away, read a book. But when I'm working from home, I tend to look up and it's 9 o'clock at night. And so I think putting those boundaries in place and taking care of yourself. So for the landscape that we're in right now, and we've really shifted. We were in the landscape of the Great Resignation for a couple of years, where people were picking up and leaving their jobs after 2 years or 20 years, or retiring early, making those shifts in the work that they were doing. I think one thing, embracing technological advancements and innovation. So obviously I poked fun at Zoom and the 5 people I needed to help me get on a Zoom in 2019 versus today. I think as a workforce, we're much more comfortable interacting virtually and on screens. And then I think when you take into place with that artificial intelligence and how that's going to, I think generative AI, and I'm by no means an expert, but I definitely have been following kind of in the HR space as this pops up, and, the ability to impersonate someone, have a meeting with someone that looks like me and talks like me, but isn't me, it's scary. And you think about the ethics around it. So there's embracing technological advancements and innovations, but also having, some thought in your HR space about security. And I think sometimes when you're not as resourced to have an infrastructure for IT, really thinking about what that's going to look like at your organization. Agile talent acquisition. So I think that's something that we've seen with the generational shift. We're at a point now where we're seeing 4 or 5 generations in some workforces. Newer employees are coming, gone are the days where it's, a 3-piece suit and multiple interviews for a position and a search that could last 2-3 months. With talent acquisition, we're looking at a lot of what is evolving in that space are kind of quicker hiring processes, being more responsive, as opposed to you apply for the job and you don't hear anything for months. And so that's something that we've seen a significant shift there. Employee well-being and mental health has been a priority. I think we've seen it with our young people, particularly those who were in late elementary to middle school. The impact of the pandemic on those students. I know I see it being on a college campus, but I think also the impact of mental health and well-being of employees, right, who are either caring for sometimes elderly parents, sometimes children, sometimes themselves, and they feel a sense of loneliness. And so I think we've seen much more awareness around mental health. There less of a stigma, but still we have more work to do. So I think the more that can be done through employee assistance programs, raising awareness about employee assistance programs, or just programs that you're running for the well-being of your employees, mental health days are actually a thing now. Well-being days are a thing at many organizations, and it's definitely becoming a promising practice and what people are looking for. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think we saw certainly in 2020, in the height of quarantine and the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd, an increased focus, a long overdue focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. And then through, various presidential transitions and, politics nationwide, like a lack of tolerance even, or, some might say, just a criticism of DEI programs in schools, in colleges and universities, in organizations. University of Florida recently completely disbanded their diversity, equity, and inclusion department. So there was so much progress being made, and what I would describe, these are my own words, as fear, that we're also seeing some backward movement. So, I think it is a time to center and it's a time for courage and bravery. And I think it's a time of fear, for a lot of people in various organizations. I really spend a lot of time reflecting on my role as an ally and what I can do to continue to lift up, issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because saying things like we don't have problems with civil rights in our organization or in our country, is concerning to me, because it's not the reality. And so I think, I share that because I think we have made real progress, and I do have a fear that we could go backwards. And it's even more concerning if it feels like right now, depending on what state you live in, you may already be moving backwards. And so I think, it's important, as I think we stressed a lot in 2020, there was a lot of education around, checking on your colleagues, checking particularly on your Black and brown colleagues in the workplace. But I'm just, I think, watching that and where that's going to go. And so how you position yourself as an organization is really important. And then continuous learning and skill development. So career pathing came up, and sometimes we work in organizations where it may not be possible if we have 5-10 people for career pathing. So what opportunities are you developing? Are there opportunities for stretch assignments that are also not taking advantage of someone? Are there opportunities for other growth, within an organization? And what we're seeing of kind of the newer employee in the workplace is this demand for continuous learning and skill development. So we're going to talk a little bit about talent management, and if there, again, any questions or any kind of reflections on my landscapes, and you can always, as Uwe said in the beginning, feel free to push back or disagree. I think it's, quite frankly, how we get our best work done. So a lot of you talked about virtual work, remote work, your organization going fully remote, having a hybrid opportunity. So virtual work has definitely become more commonplace during the pandemic. You've seen, probably, if any of you I know a couple people mentioned they were from Pittsburgh. Anyone in the area that I'm in, the Philadelphia area, I feel like when people are going back to the office, it becomes kind of national news and referred to as antiquated. Our new mayor just, called for employees, higher level employees back in their offices, because, and essentially justifying we're a city, we're trying to run a city, we need a presence in the city. My impression of that was I agreed with that. I think that there are some situations that do call for presence, teachers, for example, right? Service workers. So just thinking of at your organization, there may be some roles that call for a presence in an office or in a space, and some roles that don't. And sometimes that can create a tension. And I think that's probably one of the biggest employee relations issues I've seen. Think back to how many times someone has said, well, what are they even doing? What is Allie even doing at home? And so I think trust kind of comes to play there. We talked about the pandemic, and then, salaries, job hopping, looking for talent acquisition, agile talent acquisition. And a lot of you had compensation questions. I think a common thing that comes up is, how do we keep our compensation aligned with inflation, aligned with a potentially looming recession, and, still be competitive in the field? So these are some primary considerations for talent.
Allie, I'll jump in for just a second.
Please.
Julia in the chat mentioned that she's dealing with this very issue. Programmatic staff need to be on site when others do not.
Yeah, I mean, let's stop there for a minute, because I would love if anyone had anything to share, and you can share a challenge. This is a safe space to share. I mean, I'm always someone that says, come solutions focused, but hopefully we can help with a solution. So is anyone having additional challenges with that either want to talk through that or drop it in the chat, or has anyone found or identified a solution for how they're communicating these kind of return to work policies or return to hybrid? But I think it's a good spot to stop and kind of hear any thoughts. All right, so Jasper said all our job postings now include whether they are remote eligible. So that's great, putting it on the job posting, making it very clear if a position is remote eligible or hybrid eligible. Has anyone figured it out? Does anyone have the magic answer? Great. So this is from being on the employee side of this, always helpful to have transparent explanations of why some of us are needed on site rather than just business as usual. So I think there's real value in that too. So, sometimes there's this, as I'm reading that, I'm thinking of, right, when you're scrolling through social media and you see I have to be in the office on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and it's a picture of someone sitting in cubicles of an empty office and they're on a Zoom. And so it's, an understanding, how can you best communicate to employees the why? Why are we there? And sometimes the why is, if you don't have foot traffic and if you don't have a clear understanding of, our values are community, our values are building a collaborative culture, and that means that we want to have in-person meetings where, we're discussing things.
Alison Patino Sanchez mentioned we have 3 days remote, 2 days at office, with exceptions on some positions for the nature of their job. Steve mentioned we're 100% remote, so no worries from that aspect. Elizabeth Acomando, I believe, we don't have the virtual option at our shelter and clinic. And Julia, thank you, Julia, for giving us a heads up. Thanks for being here. Has anyone have a number of hours per week? I'm not sure that I'm reading this correctly. Okay, so I think we're just, Julia, do you want to come off?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I was wondering if anyone had done, like, instead of total full days a week, had done a number of hours per week in the office, to account for like flexibility within a day. So you don't need to come
Wow.
9 to 5 per se, but you're expected to be there a cumulative 3 days a week, but it could be like a half day or a little more flexible than maybe, picking full days per week. And if anyone had tried that.
That's an interesting idea. Somebody else had their hand up. I was just going to call on you, and you.
That's Bianca has her hand up.
Okay.
Hi, it was too much for me to type my thoughts.
No, please.
We have we're in the office 2 days and remote 3 days. But so to the point of like communicating, the only day that everybody's required in the office is Tuesday, and that's when we have our staff meeting. And again, in service of like community, everybody being there. There's a reliable way that you can have in-person meetings with your colleagues. And then the second day that everyone is able to be in the office is up to that person and their supervisor. So there's loads of flexibility for folks to choose what their other day will be. And we have direct service staff that are meeting with our client partners, but they don't meet with them in the office per se. They're meeting with them in community. So I think what makes this work for us is the amount of flexibility that there is, so that folks can kind of take care of the things that they need to take care of. And if there's a day that works better for them to be in the office, or a day that works better for them to work at home, that is then on the staff members. It's their choice to do that. And I think that works. Now, if we have to be in court or we have to go to prison or something like that, those are things we can't change. So if some of our work is going to be super rigid, then we want to be as flexible as possible on the other end. And I think that really works for us.
And it's thank you so much for sharing. And yes, that would have been intense to type, but I think, you know, what you share is that you've developed what you need for your organization, right? Because, and not everyone can take that, because not everybody has to go to court or to prison, but you looked at, okay, who are we serving? How are we serving them? How can we best serve them? But in the same time, how can we care for our employees, and how can we care for our people? Thank you so much. I think it's a great place. And Annie added something in here that really resonated with me about being clear about why you have a brick and mortar office in the first place. And, you know, that feeling. And again, I think the newer generation of employee will really question, are we here to justify the expensive? So that was definitely very clear. And I agree. Elizabeth said 2 or 3 core days where everyone is there is great, while we're maintaining the flexibility of work from home. I do. I mean, that's something that I will say that has worked for me. I transitioned to a role where I was more remote to where I'm more in person now, and having the couple days where the whole team is there, and that, you know, it is, although there's teams and there's other chat functions, there is a real benefit of kind of the walk and talk, or the check in with people, bumping into people in the office face to face. My incredible weakness is multitasking. When I'm on a Zoom, I try so hard not to do it. I can't help it. I send that text. So I'm not judging if anyone's doing that now during my webinar. I would 100% be doing it right now. So that's why when I design these, I often say, what can you walk away with, for those of you who just can't stop? I've tried. Great. Thank you. That was a great discussion. So I think thinking about, when we talk about talent, really thinking about some drivers of turnover. This isn't mine. This is from Academy to Innovate, but I think it's really good data of looking at kind of a predictive model of turnover. Obviously, this is not going to be for all of our workplaces. Some of you here are probably thinking, we don't turnover. What's that? We never have turnover. And some of you may have turnover. Maybe you have several entry-level positions and there's no very clear career path and people move on. And sometimes that's the decision. Sometimes I had a team of talent acquisition consultants. There was a desire for growth. People loved their roles. They were remote roles. And we landed on there's no career path here. So I think the data is really, I find that this data is really good to use. I do think that there's real value in creating, if you can, an opportunity, and if you have, so I'll phrase this 2 ways. One, if you have an HR department conducting stay interviews, even if you have a team of 4, 5, 10, but finding out why people like to work there. And it can be informal too. It can be, if you don't have an HR department, you can always bring in someone external to do that. You can always, I think, from a leadership level, just understanding that there's a power dynamic, so you might not get everything, but try to do a casual coffee. Try to understand what's really working well for people and to listen. And I see Dawn says, I love stay interviews. I mean, the exit interview is something we've used for many years to find out why people have left, but then often it's too late, right? And there's not much that, you can do once they've left, but you can really learn so much from that. And I think right now too, if we're really talking about the landscape, we're in a point where at most organizations, budgets are tight. And so what I think I'm seeing as a trend that, with a background in talent drives me wild is the counter offer to get someone to stay, or the retention offer, and then they stay for 6 months and then they leave anyway. And as someone who benefited from that, quite honestly, from my last role, I got a fantastic interim assignment. I stayed a little and then I still left 6 months later. And that's really all the data points to that people end up leaving anyway. So it's just really important to get a sense of, you can ask questions that are around, and I have this list of drivers up here because I think asking questions around job content, around stress, I think asking about leadership when you're the leader is a little challenging to get really honest answers. And it's also, are you ready for the answers you may get? And that's where sometimes a 360 review of you as a leader might be an opportunity.
Alison, I'll hop in really quickly with
Go ahead.
flagging 2 points. One of them, Elizabeth asked if you recommend the data by Academy to innovate. Sounds like, is there comfort in the data they offer? And then the second is, for those who don't know what a stay interview is, can you just give a brief explanation, which I think ties
Sure.
into Elizabeth's question around some examples of what those stay interviews.
Yeah, I mean, I think I love data. My doctoral work I focused primarily on qualitative data, which I think lends itself very much to the HR space. So I love data. I particularly love qualitative data, even though quantitative is pretty, I love using data. I like the Academy to Innovate. I think they have good data, but I think, again, I chose this visual because I think it captures all the drivers of employee turnover, but I think it's really unique to an organization. So it's hard to put this over every organization and say this is always the case, because I don't think it is. Stay interviews exit interviews, generally, probably many people here, if you've ever resigned from a job or left a job, often HR, or if not HR, it might be the executive director or CEO of a nonprofit or COO, will do an exit interview, and they'll ask, where are you going? Why are you leaving? Is there something we could have done to encourage you to stay? What were the positives? What were the good, bad, the ugly, and the intention? Everywhere I've worked, which is ironic because they've all been higher ed institutions in the last 10 years, has never done anything with the exit interview data, which is always fascinating to me. I've always put it on PowerPoints and made it pretty and given it to leaderships because I'm like, the answers are here. But then people still leave. So I think what has evolved, and actually I actually do not know the origin of stay interviews. If one of my colleagues on this call does, please chime in. But I love the stay interview. I heard about it a lot at a lot of the human resources organizations, professional organizations. The concept of a stay interview is to talk to your employees before they leave, right? Talk to your employees while they're your employees and get some information on why do you come to work each day? And some stay interviews are that direct. Why do you come to work each day? What do you like about your job? What do you not like about your job? How can we be more efficient? And sometimes you get some really interesting solutions. But it also is an opportunity, sometimes we inadvertently devalue our employees. And so it's an opportunity for employees to be heard and for you to do a culture check. And, to be ready to maybe respond or come up with some solutions for there. And I can send, Uva, I can send along some sample questions that people can play with after this when you send out the PowerPoint, if you want to share it as a resource.
Thank you.
For sure. So I have a pause for a process conversation. I'm going to ask you, how often do you do exit interviews with departing employees, and how do you use the data? And you don't have to be embarrassed to say we don't use the data, because I just admitted that I oversaw exit interview processes. And despite trying really hard to have people use the data, we didn't. So take a couple of minutes to. Okay, it's a great response. So if you have, I mean, typically if someone is terminated or terminated for cause, that it may not be appropriate to hold an exit interview. Generally, it's for resigning employees or employees who leave by choice. But that's a great question and great point. And again, we offer all exiting employees, but do not require, right? So sometimes someone left for family reasons, right? People come on for one project, so it's hard to get information back. Prioritize data is the negative feedback, but sometimes they get defensive, right? We all get defensive. It's definitely, I always think back to, I had an employee when I was a new leader who I used to think I was incredibly collaborative, so I would call meetings about everything. And she came to see me at one point and said, we had a meeting about, if we should use X or Y. I can't remember the content, but it was very clear an hour into the meeting that you've already decided we were going to use X. So why do we have to have that meeting? Why don't you just tell us? And I was really insulted, because I felt like I was being very collaborative, but in reflecting upon it, it was some of the best advice I ever received as a leader, was that it was okay to be more decisive. And so, I think when someone said they get defensive, I can get defensive at times too. I've learned to try not to, but it's really tough, for sure. And so I think it goes to, when you're trying to share this data, how to do that in a way that can be helpful and doesn't feel attacking. Yeah, sometimes not everyone's open and honest, and that's for sure. I think the best way to get open, honest feedback is to have someone external do a culture check or do kind of an organizational climate check, but I fully am aware that there is an external cost to that as well, but that's. And voluntary, a lot of you say they're voluntary. And I think sometimes too, employees will just say, well, if they're voluntary, what's the point anyway? But yes, if you're looking, so for my multitaskers like me, who are half kind of doing this because they're doing emails and such, my one takeaway I'll definitely flag for you is stay interviews. If you're not doing stay interviews, look at the stay interview, look at ways that you can adapt it. And so I think going to, and this kind of goes, as we talk a little bit about generational shifts, employee resource groups are something that are very popular. Obviously, if you're a smaller organization, it can be really challenging to have employee resource groups if you don't have a lot of employees. But maybe there's ways, I know that some organizations have done a really good job of like every quarter, whether it be they're going to read a book, and they're going to read a book that talks about diversity, equity, and inclusion in some way. They're going to read a book. I know I've worked with organizations who've read the book Checklist Manifesto, where it's about like to-do lists and how to work more efficiently, or they're going to talk or do something around communication. And so there's opportunities for kind of that internal, casual professional development. And then there's opportunities to kind of learn more about one another. So obviously, if you have a staff of 8 and you want to do an employee resource group for parents, and there's only one parent, then it's probably not going to work. But then creating the space, how can you create space for people to do meaningful work, to feel that they're valued and that they belong, and that they have an opportunity to kind of get to know one another. And I think hand in hand with that, sometimes the stay interviews are really helpful. to provide recognition for work that people do, so that so their work isn't unseen, and things of that nature. Great. And someone asked in the chat if I had templates for stay interviews, very similar to employee satisfaction surveys that someone asked. But I can share some of those with Uva. I think sometimes you can do pulse surveys too. So the generational shift in 2024, I think we're seeing a shift. And those of you who I've seen before know I love to talk about generational shifts. I know someone mentioned earlier on when we first started this presentation about generations in the workforce. And in my doctoral program, this was back in 2013, I remember a colleague, it was an assignment where we were kind of proofreading one another's papers. And they were doing research on organizational development and generations in the workforce. And I thought it was the most ridiculous topic at that time, and it didn't make sense to me. I probably sound like a true Gen Xer. But then when I read her work, it was fascinating, and it really opened my mind to a lot of the interactions that I had at that stage in my career. At that point, I had been working 10 or 15 years with different people in the workforce, and I got to thinking kind of generationally where they were coming from. I always make the joke, if you've seen me present, I've definitely made it before. My mother is notorious for calling me at 2:00 on a Tuesday. Can you talk? Can you go get your nails done? And I'm like, Mom, I'm working. Yeah, but you're working from home. Because from her, and she is a baby boomer, and she says, for us, working from home was you weren't working, you weren't doing anything. So the notion that that if you weren't in an office, you were definitely not working. And it always cracks me up, because I think it's from my experience, and my sister and I occasionally roar laughing about it, because, she calls during the weekday, all the time, not even at the lunch hour. So she can't even kind of play it off as lunch. But I think, it kind of goes to the different perceptions. And I think sometimes, particularly with the hybrid work, this has all come to a head, because I think, the perceptions of getting, generally, it is the younger generations who will have that perception of getting the work done wherever I am is the most efficient. And then there's that who's sitting at their desk from 8 to 5 are generally come from the older generations. And again, it's just because of social learning. I'm not saying anything to indicate an ageist stereotype. It's just how we've learned in the workplace and how we've grown up in the workplace. So I think with millennials and Gen Z, basically there's a significant influence on the workforce and increased emphasis, which I love, on flexibility. But then sometimes some of the challenges of that are those blurring of personal and professional boundaries. And so we have kind of traditionalists through Gen Z here, but these are really some key HR trends that we're seeing coming out of adapting to a multi-generational workforce: remote and flexible work, a focus on DEI, belonging, emphasis on mental health and well-being, skill development, continuous learning, and then leveraging technology in the process. So these are really some things that we have seen and improve a lot of changes with in the workforce. And so someone said earlier when we were talking about reporting back to work or hybrid work, engaging in that open and transparent conversation. So being clear about why, someone is required to come back to the office, even if it's simply because we want to have in-person meetings to build culture and collaboration, really thinking through those requirements. Embracing flexibility has become important, quite frankly, for all generations. And I think as we're seeing this multi-generational workforce, I identify as a part of a sandwich generation where I'm caring for older parents and also younger children. And so, how are we kind of managing all that? The need for flexibility is important. And I think that's something, again, there were obviously so many horrendous things that came out of the pandemic, but one of the positives is this kind of newfound embracing of flexibility, prioritizing well-being, a culture of inclusion. So again, these are all kind of things that have become a hot topic as we talk about multi-generational workforces. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about compensation. And, you know, my lens for compensation is always one on equity. And yeah, so let's stop. Are there any examples that anyone has about where folks are succeeding in a multi-generational workplace? Oh, couching it as part of our DEI practices, which I think is important, right? There's, you know, bringing it as part of it is part of diversity, right? Age is a category when we think through diversity and the backgrounds that people bring. And I think there's some education there too, right? So I think that we have, as a workplace, as a country, have become more progressive, and I'm hoping are still going that route. So, you know, you may have someone who's not used to seeing preferred pronouns in an email signature in the workplace because they never have. So it does actually tie sometimes to tying. Oh, to deal with intergenerational issues, we ended up unionizing, which really helped and made clear the stakes for everyone. That's really fascinating. Training for leaders in the organization, management skill development to align with the times. Right. Managing people, you know, feedback, having a feedback loop is more important for some than others. You know, I know, again, from my own journey, I feel like my first 10 years of the workforce, I did what I was told and that was it. And I was happy I had a job. And I think things are different now, right? People are coming into the workforce, and I've learned a lot from generations that have come after me in terms of, you know, questions to ask, comfort asking questions, courage to ask questions. So definitely. So I want to talk in the interest of time too. Fostering a culture of learning is a big part of this. Yes, yes. Thank you, Uva Coles. That's what you're doing today for us, is helping us to foster a culture of learning. So when I think about pay, and I think this will, and compensation, I think of it, I'm probably more progressive than the places I've worked when I think about pay. I am very much a staunch advocate for pay equity. I believe in paying people for the jobs they're doing, not one job and then adding other duties as assigned, which sometimes can fall on some people more than others, depending on their background. So I like to think of it, you know, as from a social justice lens, which I know this is definitely the venue. I imagine some places would not be comfortable with me talking about this, but thinking of, and so here are some questions. I'm not going to dive too deeply into compensation because it's different everywhere. But I like to think of looking at, and a good place to start either with your team or with your board is, you know, distributive, procedural, interactional, and informational justice. So is pay consistent? Is it equitable across race, gender, ability, other demographic areas? I know someone talked about neurodiversity in the workforce. Does performance consistently impact pay? So are we using a pay for performance? Are we being clear if we're just simply doing cost of living adjustments? And I think with inflation, sometimes if there may only be a 2 to 3% merit pool, then maybe it's just a cost of living. So things that you want to consider. Are pay decisions consistent? Are they applied consistently? Do those procedures uphold our equity and our values? So that's to think procedurally, like, are we giving pay increases? Are we only giving pay increases to people who are quitting and we don't want to see them leave? Because people are watching and they see that. And so then people are like, oh, well, in order to get an increase or recognized for my work, I have to get a new job for them to say, wow, we really value you. And that's everywhere I have been for the last couple of years. That's a pretty constant theme. And again, the data says that person's going to leave anyway in another 6 to 9 months. So it's just something to consider. Our employee concerns about pay responded to with care and respect. Our negotiations about pay conducted with respect and care. So how are you handling it when someone negotiates pay? How are you handling it when someone questions their pay? Do you have other ways if people can't negotiate pay? Can you add, are there vacation days? Is there time off you can add? Are there other ways from like a total rewards package approach that you can offer things to employees? How is data about pay made available? Some of you, if you have 990s, it's going to be public anyway. And are paid details communicated in a timely manner? Do you have a process? I have some colleagues on this call that I know I worked with where they were really thoughtful about how do we manage stipend? How do we manage interim assignments? We want to make sure that we're doing it the same way for everyone. And, even at a smaller organization, I think it's really commendable to be thoughtful about that so that the look is that equity is important to you and you're showing people that they're valued. So I want you to think about what I just put up around compensation, which I'm sure some of you haven't had the chance to think about in that level of detail. But considering where you are now, what strategies and actions do you think you could take to move you closer to justice? And by justice, I mean that compensation justice when I was thinking about equity and things of that nature. So these are the 4 areas. I'm going to leave this up instead of the question. What steps are you taking? It's a great question. Someone said, how much transparency do you recommend in terms of compensation? I definitely don't recommend, unless it's public anyway in tax documents, I don't recommend posting everyone's salary, on a board in the office. But I do, think it is beneficial to have, if you have a range or if you have a band for a position, being clear about when someone is eligible for the midpoint of the salary band. Does everyone start at the midpoint of a salary? Is there a set starting salary? How do people move up? So I just think about how the decisions are made. That's a great question. So I definitely don't think like, here's Allie Dougherty and Uva Coles' salary by any means, but I think being able to make things available. I think also some of the things that we're seeing it's embraced as an anti-racist approach to compensation is looking at experience and qualifications. So if someone has a master's degree and 1 year of experience, but another employee doesn't have the education because maybe they didn't have the opportunity, but they have 15 years of experience that would make them qualified for the role. Is there kind of a balance you can do? So we're seeing a lot of places not just simply require a degree, which if you remember 15, 20 years ago, the word was, oh, if you don't have a bachelor's degree, you'll never get a job. And now it's more like we need to look beyond those educational degrees and look at people's experiences, and experiences come in all different forms and ways. And can we do an equivalency? So we can set up, it's part of the work that we did at Drexel as part of our anti-racism task force, is we set up equivalencies, because for many years to work in an institution of higher education, you needed at least a master's period. And we were losing some really good people because they couldn't even make the minimum qualification, but they had loads of experience in a certain area. So it helped to cast a wider net to kind of put these equivalencies in place. We found that talking about the salary range and candidates' expectation during the interview process is very helpful. I think that's great. So to make sure that people understand the salary process, there's nothing worse than, I've actually worked at organizations where we don't post the salary, and I'm a big proponent of put it out there. Post the salaries on the jobs you're hiring for. If the salary is $65,000, if it's $165,000, post it so that when people are applying, you cut out that kind of back and forth about if it's in, and people are sometimes really surprised at how low or how high the salary is. So you definitely want to make sure that it's clear. Leveled education, right? Midpoint versus what it means, where you fall in the salary band. Great. I'm glad that was helpful. So my running joke, my doctoral research was on institutional courage. And, Uva, spoke to my candor when she introduced me. And that's one thing I will say is definitely dead on. I have a running joke. I actually said I report to the chief diversity officer where I work now. And I always said, oh, don't worry. I always have the courage to say things even without the psychological safety. But I realize I'm kind of a unicorn in that way, that I will speak up, even if I know it's not a safe place. And I always joke like, I'll just go consult if it doesn't work out. that's a very privileged place to be. Not many people are there. Most people don't feel the comfort to speak up unless they have that psychological safety. So that's why, you know, I kind of give that leading into it, because I am always an advocate for creating brave spaces for people, because I know I do my best work when I have the courage to speak and when I can speak without fear. And so I think, you know, I have made sure to create those spaces for colleagues of mine, whether they report to me or I report to them. And so I think one of the things, you know, I want to really end on building an environment of trust. So being able to take risks and speak up, you know, it really, for most people, the majority of people, it involves psychological safety. So feeling like, and someone said earlier, like, yeah, I don't know if our leadership likes to see the data from the exit interviews, or they get offended. And so that's, you know, that can be an environment where things aren't safe if people take things personally. And I think the way that we do that is we build self-awareness. You know, we build an ability to listen to feedback, to create feedback loops, to be able to give feedback and receive feedback, and not take that feedback personally. Allies, making space, you know, as an ally for people who may be overlooked or ignored. I am continually learning how to be an ally in all of the work that I do and in all of the spaces that I'm in. Um, it's not always easy. Sometimes I think, you know, people jump to rescue. Well, I'm going to tell them that they said Allison's name wrong. You know, as opposed to going and saying, hey, Allison, I noticed I said, how can I help in that situation? So I think, you know, creating space for allyship, being thoughtful and direct about feedback, which is not always easy. It takes practice. I love a good role play if anyone needs it at any point. I would have done a role play now, but it would have been towards the end of the show, and I fear you all may have left. I believe in saying I live by policies, so I am responsible for my organization's civil rights policies. So I believe in saying what you do and doing what you say. So whatever your policy says, you should do. And then making mistakes. So my favorite environments are the environments where people are very comfortable raising their hand and saying, oh gosh, I really messed this up, and thinking through how we can fix them. And we've talked about building inclusive workspaces. I think as we talked about the intergenerational differences, you know, communicating goals, holding effective meetings, right? How I think my biggest fear is I'm going to call a meeting with the team I work with, and they're going to say behind my back, this meeting could have been an email. So, you know, are we creating meetings that are productive, that are helpful, that are worthwhile? Are we communicating goals? And I think I have, the next few slides, because I want to get to general questions at the end. The next few slides, examples of inclusive behaviors at work, what behaviors can be discouraged. And then I have an inclusive team charter. I love this. I love sitting as a team and say, how do we communicate? Are we using Teams? Are we using chats? Are we communicating face to face? How do we have conflicts? Some people say, the team I work with, we deal with some pretty heavy stuff. We have this like handshake, never conflict over an email. And it's fantastic. I'm terrible in conflicts over email because I'm so direct that it probably comes off harsher than it needs to be. So I think this is a takeaway for you to use in terms of building an inclusive team charter. It's some inclusive norms of how you discuss things. And then this is going back to my influencers. So I mentioned Toby Alawale and Ifrid Samba had in their roundtables key learnings in leadership. And all of these resonated with me in terms of, you know, and some more than others, but I really connected to promoting a culture of openness and leading with kindness and empathy. I just love all of these, and I think they're a good reminder for those of us who know that our work is hard and that sometimes we face challenges. My next slide is just a standard slide that says questions. So I'm going to leave this one up there for you now just to kind of take in. And I just want to open it up for questions. I know some people had to hop out early, so I want to make sure we open it for questions. I also will say, I know I'm always very cautious. You know, sometimes you read those leadership books that sound amazing, but there's no way you could operationalize those. So whenever I'm creating these types of presentations, I know that sometimes things I said earlier, idealistic but unrealistic. Sometimes when you're in the throes of it, a conflict, an employee issue, it just seems like you're never going to get through it. So I will offer, and I've said this before to Uva too, like if you reach out to me, if you have a question, it's not something I'm going to bill you for. I'm happy to kind of help and kind of work through anything if you need it, or any questions after this. I will send to Uva and Lauren I have to dig them up, so I just might need a few hours to a day, some standard questions for stay interviews and some articles around stay interviews, because there seemed to be a lot of interest in that. I also might send over some of the findings. I have a whole report, it's not mine, around, and it'll be cited and have all that information around generations in the workplace, because I've found it quite fascinating. But I will thank those of you who need to hop off, but also hang around if anyone has any lingering questions or comments.
Sure. We can transition if we can take the presentation off, Allison, and answer some of the questions that are coming up. I'll start with Elizabeth, who has a question, and we'll ask her to unmute and ask away. That was Elizabeth here, I think.
I'm sorry to be the first to speak, but I was really excited to listen to this. I'm a new nonprofit founder, and so I realized I was sitting here in the posture of being very triggered as a former employee from like a fairly hostile work environment. And so all the stuff that we're like, this is annoying that they want pay equity. I'm like, no, I remember being on the other side of that and really the difficulty of it. So I realized my baseline question is that it's been so helpful to have your level setting of sort of cultural values. And I wonder if there's a resource or a book that you would recommend for those of us who are new to this, that's just like, instead of here are all the things we all know we've complained about as other people's employees, like, is there a 101 of like, here are some best practices that are like your thing about like no conflict over email. I immediately was like, it's been great to have a paper trail when there has been conflict, actually. So stuff like that that's in conflict, I was thinking through. So I don't know if you have like just a 101 of best practices that are concrete and how those things translate. That'd be super helpful. And thank you so much for all this space.
Sure, it's I have to think on, but I'm also, if anyone else has a book they'd like to throw out there. I do love, I mentioned Checklist Manifesto, but that's not necessarily working through these type of things, but I think it's good for like organizational planning. I've always loved the 5 dysfunctions of teams. I think it might be dated now though, so if it is, someone just call me out on that. But that's an old one. And I do like a lot of Adam Grant, who's a professor at University of Pennsylvania. But if anyone else has a book, please throw it out there for a suggestion.
You know, it sounds really corny, but I really like Brene Brown's Dare to Lead.
Oh, I like Brene Brown. I feel like Brene Brown and Adam Grant have a podcast, Jasper. So that's
Totally
great.
do. They have a symbiotic relationship.
Yes, very much so. I do love Dare to Lead. Dare to Lead is great too. Brene Brown is great.
And it's an old one, but Good to Great was really good too. It was like from the early 2000s.
Okay.
I think Bridgespan also has like really short toolkits on like effective meetings and also delegating and decisions.
Great. These are all awesome suggestions.
In addition to those resources, are there other salient questions based on everything you heard that you might have for Allison as we prepare to close out?
I actually have a question about patience when being the person who is speaking up and trying to advocate for others in the organization with senior leadership who may have grown up in an industry that was very different from this industry, and they are learning and you're kind of trying to guide them. You're younger than them. You're trying to navigate some of the politics of that. and just finding that balance of being a thought leader and knowing you've been put in place to have a position of leadership and that your opinion is valued, but also trying to find that right balance of patience when educating someone who is from a different generation. And there was that gap.
Yeah, I think that's I mean, my I've considered I have this running joke with myself where I feel like everywhere I've worked, I've been a change agent, but sometimes as a change, it's exhausting. And so I think, right, that they'll say the worst thing you could say is, well, this is the way we've always done it. And I think, again, as we get more senior in our careers, it's more difficult to change. And so I think with change, like making sure you're doing what you can to focus on your well-being and what you're doing and what your goals are and how you can best, I think, learning how to best communicate with the people you're trying to communicate. And I think a lot of resources on change and change management, sometimes even through like LinkedIn Learn or simply Google searches around how to best communicate your change. And there's something, I'll have to see if I can find it, around communicating change across generations, which I think has been incredibly helpful. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I feel like I'm like, yes, patience, change is hard, so be patient. And that's probably not helpful, but hopefully validating.
We have time for one more question as we prepare to transition out. Anyone else? Does anyone else have anything related to everything you heard, maybe a follow-up or something that we didn't have an opportunity to touch on today? Allison, I'm volunteering you for all the things, by the way. So Allison, as we are closing out, while everyone kind of chews a little bit on everything you offered, any closing thoughts on your end based on where people are as they shared? Lauren has one. I'm interested in thoughts on how to approach someone hitting the top of the salary band, either here or in follow-up resources. A really good question around salaries.
Yeah, this is going to be, I'm ending on my terrible answers, but I feel like it depends, right? It depends on where they're positioned at the organization, the institutional knowledge they have. I think an analysis of, is there an opportunity? Obviously, you never want to ask someone, are you ready to retire? You never want to ask that. That's illegal. But is it a situation of transition? Is there an opportunity to consult? Is there an opportunity for more growth? I think it just depends again on the person. And Lauren, I'd be happy if I know Uva's going to share my contact if you want to talk more about that. And I'm really grateful for all you all shared. I mean, you're just seeing some of the organizations you're from and knowing the work that Spring Point does. I know that your work matters and helps the community. I know I've benefited or know someone who has, but I'm really grateful for spending time with you. As we all know, it's always so much easier to be in a room together with sandwiches or food. I mean, food just makes everything easier, but I really enjoyed this. As those of you who have presented at these types of things, you always have that panic of what if no one says anything? So I'm really grateful for everything you've all said. I've learned it's always a benefit when I can learn as well. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Allison. Since I am off mute, I'll just give a little clap for you and I think that's from the entire group that is with us today. Clearly, your expertise is needed, helpful, and I think relevant to many of the challenges our partners are facing, no matter the size, the scope, or the work they do. So we're really just thankful that you took some time to be with us. As I kind of reflect on everything we talked about, there seemed to be a lot of energy around state interviews, from how to use them to requesting samples of how to apply them. I really appreciate that we had an opportunity to have this kind of two-way community learning. And so thanks to all of you who shared your own solutions or approaches with each other. And certainly I encourage you to stay in the chat. And if you can be a resource to others and want to be a resource, put your email so that others might be able to reach out to you as well. I think sometimes the solutions live within our community. Oftentimes, you're doing some incredibly interesting things. You think it's just what you do, and you may not realize that you have a gem that others could benefit from. So if you think you're doing something interesting and you want to share that with others, let us know. We're happy to either create a platform for you or share with others as well. On our end, we're going to review the chat to see where you landed, questions that maybe went unanswered, and see if we can partner with Alison to send additional resources to you. So look out for the survey and our resources. It'll take us a day or two extra now because we want to make sure we're compiling as many answers as we possibly can. At the top of this, Alison shared a quote with us, and it was actually from one of the influencers that Alison, you follow. I thought it was interesting. Your manager has more impact on your mental health than your therapist or your doctor. Having a good boss can literally change your life. And that hit me because I think it's a good reminder that this work of leading, of managing, of supervising and supporting people is work that matters and anchors everything we do. Right? Anchors everything we do. And sometimes we do it so often, and I think so well, many of us, that we forget it's important. When we're doing it well, we just kind of do it, right? But you're doing important work, this work of supporting and managing individuals. So I want to thank you for all of you that are charged with supporting those people within your organizations. They really are at their core. With that, thank you, Alison, and thanks to all of you, including the Spring Point Partners team and Witty Gritty for their support in this session. You may have seen Don Holden Woods, a consultant who works very closely with many of you. There were a few questions that went Don's way, and Don had some answers for that. If you have an interest in partnering more directly with Don, let us know, and we will try to connect you with her as well. Thanks to all of you who participated. As we close out, just a few tiny reminders. First, in the chat and definitely in the survey that's coming your way, let us know what a part 2 to this conversation might look like. I think we just scratched the surface. Alison has a lot more to say. We wanted to try to contain it in a way that would be helpful as a beginning. But if there's more you want to learn in this space, put it in the chat, and we'll see if we can have a part 2 within our learning series or figure out a different way to engage with Alison and with all of you. If there is an area related, again, to talent management, let us know. Again, you can use the chat or use the survey a little bit later on. As for announcements, our next learning session will be on May 30th from 2 to 3:30 Eastern Time. And we are in that session discussing impact measurement that is rooted in community care. We have an incredible set of speakers who I think will be really helpful to the work you do, especially those of you who are grappling with how to get community voice, how to measure the impact that you are having, that your work is having, and its relationship with communities. We'll explain what that looks like in more detail soon. We also invite you to join us for tomorrow's Life of Riley session, where our partners will raise awareness of human to animal connections and advocacy from leading voices in the field. We were excited to have someone from CARE and from other organizations making those connections with us today. But there's a specific session that delves into this work more deeply tomorrow with Life of Riley, 2 to 3:30. In the chat, you will have the link to register for that. Additionally, feel free to check out our podcast. Really excited about this as we close out. Our Wellspring launched earlier this week and features the origin stories of leading voices in the field. Many of them are partners, especially in our first few episodes, so look out for that. They will be sharing their learnings along the leadership journey. They're amazing, and we're just excited that they were willing to share their stories. You can find them in the link that is in the chat now. Finally, I would be remiss as we close out if I didn't touch on timing. We are mid-May, really thinking about how we honor women in a more pronounced way for Women's History Month. In my mind's eye, we ought to do this all year. So with that, I'll close with one of my favorite quotes, which I think describes the posture of many of you in the room today and many of you who work with amazing women. I am not free, while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own. That's by Audre Lorde. Here's to freeing, supporting, and lifting each other, even when our challenges look a little different, and maybe especially when our challenges look a lot different. That's our collective superpower. Thank you all for joining. Remember to make every room you step into a classroom. We appreciate that you were with us today. Have a wonderful afternoon. Alison, thank you again.